Autumn 1882. They banished the widow to the dry quarter, the played-out claim with the dead well and nothing else, and gave her until the first snow to be gone. A widow alone, no money, no kin, no name the law would honor. The town was certain the cold would settle the matter for them. What nobody thought to ask was why a woman with one shovel left would spend her last week of daylight at the bottom of a dry well. They found out in deep January, when the same people who'd cast her out were lowering themselves down a rope into the one warm room left in the county. But in the autumn, it was just the tidy end of a sad story. Her name was Cora Mallen, 34. Her husband, Walt, had sunk wells across 3 counties, knew the ground the way a sailor knows water, and a summer fever took him in a week, quiet and stupid and final. Walt had filed their good claim under a partnership, and when he died, the partner produced papers Cora couldn't read her way around, and a judge who wouldn't meet her eye. And the end of it was that she got the dry quarter, a quarter section of hardpan with a half-dug well that had never struck water, and a shack the wind walked through like a door left open. They expected her to leave. The partner even offered her stage fare east, which everyone agreed was decent of him. Cora didn't take the fare. She walked out to the dead well and looked down it. It went down 30 feet, Walt's own work, abandoned when the water didn't come. A clean shaft through dirt and then soft rock, dry as a bone all the way to the bottom. And Cora Mallen knew something about a 30-foot shaft that the town, in all its certainty, had never once had cause to learn. The deep ground is warm. Not warm like a fire, warm like a held breath. Walt had taught her that on 100 jobs, that the frost only reaches down a few feet, and below it, the earth sits steady in the low 50s straight through the worst January, the same as it sits in July. A house on the surface fights the whole sky and loses. But 30 feet down, the cold simply never arrives. The well that had failed to give Walt water was, without anyone meaning it to be, the warmest spot on the whole quarter section. She had until the first snow. She used every hour of it down that shaft. She widened the bottom into a chamber a person could lie down in, bracing it with the timber from the dead windmill and the shack she tore down board by board, no use to her on the surface anyway. She floored it with planks over dry brush so the cold of the rock wouldn't pull at her through the night. Halfway up the shaft, she built a stout platform and a hatch, then capped the wellhead itself with a double cover of planks and sod, leaving a gap for a ladder and a thin iron pipe she ran up the side for a small fire's smoke. She rigged a windlass and a rope to lower wood and water and herself when her legs were too tired for the ladder. And at the bottom, on a flat stone, she set a little firebox no bigger than a lard pail, vented careful up that pipe because she knew as well as Walt ever had that bad air pools in a shaft and kills you gentle. She kept the fire small and the draft honest, and she tested it 3 nights running with a candle on the floor before she'd trust it with her sleep. By the time the first snow came hissing across the hardpan, Cora Mallen was 30 feet down, dry and braced and warm. The thermometer she'd hung at the wellhead read 12 above. At the bottom of the shaft, on a pail-sized fire, it held at 53. Up in town they saw a thread of smoke rising out of the ground on the dry quarter and laughed and said the widow had gone and built herself a fire in a hole, which was precisely what she'd done. Then the winter came down hard enough to stop the laughing. The cold settled in the first week of January and stayed. 17 below, then 24, then a flat gray morning the glass read 35 under zero, and a wind off the open plain that found the heart of every house in town. The livery lost 2 horses standing in their stalls. The Aldous family burned their pews. They'd taken to sleeping in the church for the big stove, and the big stove ate everything they fed it and gave back cold. A freighter caught between towns was found sitting upright in his wagon, reins still in his hands. Surface houses, every one of them, bleeding heat into a sky that took it as fast as they could make it. And out on the dry quarter, a thin, straight line of smoke rose out of the frozen ground and did not waver, day after day, like something that knew it had nowhere to be but exactly there. The eldest boy spotted it, sent out scavenging, and ran home to say the widow's hole was smoking. His father said she was burning her last. His grandmother, who had buried 2 husbands and a great deal of nonsense, said, "A hole doesn't lose its heat to the wind, fool. Go and see." They went on a white, still morning, half the frozen family, and stood at the capped wellhead, not knowing whether to call down it. Then the hatch lifted, and Cora Mallen climbed up the ladder into the daylight, thinner, sooty, but clear-eyed and steady, and looked at the children shivering on the hardpan. "Come down out of the wind," she said. "It's warmer at the bottom." Before I tell you who came to that wellhead last, if you're down in the dark with Cora now, do one small thing for me. Tap subscribe so the next story finds you. Then let me finish it. By the second week of January, word had crossed the whole frozen county. They came across the hardpan in 1s and 2s, and Cora lowered them down the shaft on Walt's windlass rope, 2 at a time, into a warm room at the bottom of a failed well. She warmed them by the lard pail fire, melted snow so they could drink, and sent every family home with hot stones and the same plain lesson her husband had spent his life proving. The cold only reaches down a little way. Get below it. Stop trying to beat the sky and go to the warmth that's already waiting under your feet. A whole county learning well digging from a widow they'd written off. And on the worst morning of the freeze, the partner came out to the dry quarter, the man whose papers had put her there. He'd come, he'd say later, to see whether the claim was clear. The truth was, his fine house in town had gone cold around him, and he had nowhere else that wasn't worse. His ears were frostbitten white. He stood at the capped wellhead of the dead well he'd handed her as a punishment, and he could not make his mouth work. Cora climbed up the ladder and looked at him a long, long moment. Long enough for the courthouse and the stage fair and the whole decent-seeming theft to come back and stand between them. Then she said, "There's a rope. Sit in the loop and hold on." He rode the windlass down into the warm dark and sat among the people his papers had meant to scatter at the bottom of the well he'd given her to die in. He didn't apologize. Men who steal politely rarely know how. But when he came back up at dusk, he stood a while at the wellhead, and then he said the dry quarter was hers, free and recorded, and the good claim besides, that he'd see to all of it. And the shame in his voice was the first honest thing he'd given her. A newspaperman rode out in February and climbed down that well and wrote the line that outlived everyone in it. The widow who went down to find the warmth. The recorder read it, heard the whole county testify, and Cora Mallen got back every acre. She lived another 29 years on that land, and she struck good water in the end, 2 quarters over. But she never filled in the dead well. She kept it capped and timbered and ready, and on the coldest nights of her long life, the neighbors said, the widow Mallen still climbed down out of the wind to sleep where the earth kept its warmth. At the bottom of the well, the whole town had been so sure would be her grave. The cold only reaches down so far, she'd tell them. After that, the ground takes care of its own. If you've ever been handed something everyone called dead and dry and made it the one place worth being, tell me about it in the comments. And to keep these frontier survival stories coming every week, tap the red subscribe button right below this video.